Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the last of our 2021 economic policy forums. Today it is my pleasure to introduce David Autor, who is the Ford Professor of Economics in the MIT Department of Economics. David is rather an unusual economist. His undergraduate degree from Tufts is in psychology, and his PhD is in public policy from the Kennedy School. From there, he went straight to being an assistant professor at MIT, where he has been ever since, having done most interesting work on a wide range of topics in labor economics. Today, he's here to talk to us about building better jobs in the age of machines. In his position as co-chair of the MIT Task Force on Work of the Future. And so it is my great pleasure to introduce David. David will talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll go to questions. If you have a question that you want to have asked during the question session, then just type it into the Q&A. If you go to the bottom of your screen, you'll see that there's a box for Q&A. Click on that, you will open up the box, and you can type your questions in there, and I will direct them to Professor Autor at the end of the talk during the question and answer period. So David, on to you.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the introduction. Thanks for those who are attending, and I'm looking forward to your questions at the end of my remarks, which I intend to keep to 40 minutes. Let me start by sharing my slides. Good. Okay. So my talk is called Building Better Jobs in an Age of Intelligent Machines. And this kind of distills a lot of the work of the MIT Task Force on the Work of the Future, which was set up by MIT's President Raphael Reif. To basically try to address two questions. One are how emerging technologies changing the nature of work and the skills required, and how can we design and leverage technological innovations for the benefit of everyone in society. Our task force comprised a lot of people. I won't tell you all their names. My co-chairs were David Mindell and Elizabeth Reynolds, both of MIT. So let me try to see if I can, put my thoughts together in a way that I hope is constructive for you thinking about this question. These are just some of the products of our work. That's what they look like. No big deal. Here's the agenda. So, a lot of people are talking about the future of work at this point, and they have a lot of concerns about is automation, threatening employment? How is it changing employment, even if it's not threatening? Do we have any control over this process? Is there actually anything within our hands, or is it just we are subject to impersonal economic forces? What are we getting and what are we losing? And so I want to try to answer those questions thoughtfully if I can. I first want to kind of give you some big picture economic context that sort of frame the problem. What is working, what is not working. Then I want to try to give you a quick summary of the technological context, which sort of, we talked about in our report, and which helps frame our thinking about what's happening in the labor market. Then I want to talk about what I see as the big challenges, and what I do think has gone wrong, and ask the question about, is it in net, are we doing it well despite all the challenges? And spoiler alert, the answer will be no. And then I want to finally conclude by talking about, well, how could we do a bit better? So let me begin. So let me start with the economic context. Many of you know that the last 200 years have been the most innovative, the most automated in all of human history. This has been the only period of sustained century-on-century growth in in world history, world human history. And it's interesting to ask, after 2 centuries of rapid automation, why are there still so many jobs, actually? Why are so many people still working? So you can see that from between 1890 and 2015, the fraction of the US adult population in the paid workforce has risen through most of this time. Now, a lot of that rise reflects women leaving unpaid, highly restrictive work in the household to enter the paid labor market, where they have more opportunities and greater creativity and expression and a range of choices. But it's really quite remarkable that, in fact, in this time where we have, taken tractors and made our labor less relevant in agriculture, where we no longer make tools by hand, where we no longer do bookkeeping using actual books, we managed to keep ourselves employed. So why is the starting point? Hasn't automation eliminated employment so far? I think it's useful to ask that question. And I think there are three basic reasons for this to keep in mind. The first is what I would just call insatiability, that our needs sort of rise one for one with our incomes, or needs is a psychological concept, not a biological concept. And so our perceived needs rise one for one with our income. So for example, here's a picture I love. This is the Caven family of California in 1985. There's a book by this photographer named Peter Menzel that just sort of takes pictures of everything everybody owns. And you can see this is a house. This is 35 years ago. And you can see all of the stuff that filled their house, from multiple appliances to, huge numbers of books, to many bicycles, to lots and lots of toys. And you can see, look, most of the things in that household are not necessities. And yet, people have them and desire them because their income support them. So one reason that we don't automate ourselves out of work is, as we get wealthier, we tend to demand a lot more stuff, and that creates more work. A second factor, which I think is highly, highly important and often overlooked, is it is not the case that automation simply eliminates work. Many of us think, oh, a machine does some part of my job. And that's certainly true. It's absolutely the case that automation takes over certain human tasks. Simultaneously, many of the automation we work with are actually tools that improve us and improve the way we work and make our time more productive and more valuable. So for example, think of nail guns that make roofers able to cover entire houses in the course of a day, in something that would have previously taken multiple days. Or all diagnostic tests used by medical professionals that allow them to much more efficiently figure out what's wrong with us and give us more effective treatment. Or think of CAD software that allows people to render ideas and designs and calculate their engineering requirements, not only more rapidly but more creatively, and to prototype electronically without actually building. Or think of something like Khan Academy, something that gives teachers much more effective tools to reach larger audiences, to teach more efficiently, to teach more creatively, to use a whole new way of presenting ideas. Or, but these are not all cognitive activities. Think of, if you are a long haul trucker nowadays, you will use route planning software and load planning software such that you never drive with an empty truck. You always are carrying something of value. And so I make these points to emphasize these are all forms of automation, and they certainly take over some of the tasks that were previously done by people, but simultaneously they make us more valuable as workers. So we should recognize that machines don't simply replace us. They also, in many things we do, complement us by giving us better tools. But there's a third reason why technological change has not tended to make human labor redundant. And that is that we don't simply get better at the work we do. We actually create a lot of new work that didn't previously exist. So, whoops, that's not what I wanted to happen. Oh, there we go. Okay. So this is a figure that shows you employment in the United States in 1940 and 2018 across 12 major occupations that are mutually exclusive and exhaustive, cover all of employment, and ranked roughly from lowest paid to highest paid. So for example, if you look at 1940, almost half of all employment was found in two places: farming and mining, and in production work. If you roll forward to 2018, you can see farming is a very small part of employment, as is production. The largest shares are found in professional and managerial work, also clerical and administrative work, and also a lot in personal services. So the distribution of jobs has changed a lot. Now you might be saying, well, what are these two different colors here? Well, the green bars are employment in occupational titles that existed in 1940. So if you were to stack up all those light green bars, you would find they stack to about the same height as all the blue bars. In other words, there isn't a lot more employment in 2018 in jobs that existed in 1940. Instead, most of the new employment is in new work that was created in the intervening 8 decades. And but what I mean by new work is detailed detailed occupations that were not present 8 decades earlier. So let me give you some examples of those. Here, these are titles. These are new job titles that are added by the U.S. Census Bureau to their internal documents to keep track of the jobs in the U.S. economy. So let me be more specific about that. If you fill out a census form, you will be asked your occupation and industry. That is not a checkbox. You actually write those words in. You say what occupation you're in, what industry you're in, what you do. The Census Bureau then reads those and they have to classify them. They have to categorize them. And as they categorize them, they create these sort of phone books of things that people write in so that the census classifiers can look at those phone books and say, when someone says, textile chemist, that maps to this major occupation. And there are about 30,000 of these in every decade, and they keep updating them. So we can see when new things were added. So in 1940, for example, automatic welding machine operators were added. In 1960, textile chemists. In 1980, controllers of remotely piloted vehicles. In 2000, artificial intelligence specialists. So actually, it's actually amazing how fast these things actually come into the census, right? You wouldn't have thought there were a lot of people in our AI in 2000, but the Census Bureau was aware of them. Or in 2018, pediatric vascular surgeon. So you look at this list, you say, I see. Technology is creating all these these jobs that involve, using, implementing, integrating, advancing the technology itself. But now let me show you another set of jobs that were also added in these same decades. So in 1940, we saw gambling dealers, then in 1960, pageant directors, in 1980, hypnotherapists, in 2000, chat room hosts, in 2018, drama therapists, or in 2020, 2010, sommeliers, which are those people who, tell you what wine to buy at a very expensive restaurant. And of course, let me be clear, sommeliers have been around since as long as the French Republic has been around, but there weren't enough of them working in the United States for the Census Bureau to notice. So the idea I want to convey here is it is not simply the case that we are slowly automating ourselves into a smaller and smaller set of tasks and just encroaching until there's nothing left. In fact, we are also creating new activities that demand expertise, that demand specialized skills, that people have to invest in and learn, and those things are valuable. So the world is changing and not just narrowing. And this is important. If you were to read, for example, the recent book by the economist Daniel Susskind called A World Without Work, he very much envisions this idea of just asymptotic encroachment of machinery into human domains without any expansion of human domains. And I think it's important to keep in mind that both these things are going on. That doesn't mean one doesn't happen faster than the other. They're both going on. Okay, so that's the good news. We're not running out of work, and for the 3 reasons I mentioned. We're insatiable. Automation complements us. It makes us more productive as it substitutes some of our tasks, and we tend to create new stuff. However, it's not all good. Let me make that very clear. The challenge, actually, that we mostly face is not the quantity of jobs, but the quality of jobs. So this figure shows you the evolution of productivity and pay in the United States from 1948 to 2018. So this purple line is productivity per hour of work. So that rose 250% between 1948 and 2016. If you look at this blue line, which is average compensation, right? That's the average of all what people are earning. That rose in tandem with the purple line, and pretty much did that all the way through 2018. There is some divergence here. This is what is referred to as labor's falling share of national income, and that's something I could talk about, but won't mention much further right now. But the key thing I want to draw your attention to is median compensation, right? Which is the wage that that the person at the 50th percentile earns. Half of people earn slightly more than half of people earn somewhat more than that. Half of people earn somewhat less than that, and that has been pretty much stagnant for the last 40 years. So even as productivity has risen, the earnings experience of the typical worker has not really improved very much. Now, you can look at this, and if you've taken many economics classes, you can say, well, we don't really measure median compensation that accurately. Maybe it's risen faster than that. Maybe you're understating it, and that's certainly possible. But if that's true, I would also be understating the growth of productivity per hour. So the gap between those two things is quite substantial and significant. And you can say, well, how is it possible that the average has risen so much and the median has been so stagnant? Well, the answer is, at least descriptively, is rising inequality. If you look at real earnings of people by education level from 1963 to 2018 or 2017, this shows you for 5 levels of education, people with post-baccalaureate educations like master's degrees, doctoral degrees, MDs, law degrees, people with a 4-year college degree, people with some college, exactly high school, and less than high school. This on the left is men, this on the right is women. And what you can see is since about 1980, there's been this remarkable fanning out of real earnings levels by education. And people who have a college or greater education have seen substantial earnings growth in these 4 decades, particularly for people with post-college education and particularly among women, which is terrific. However, if you look at people with some college or high school only or less than high school education, real earnings have either stagnated or fallen in these same times. So for example, if you look at people, men without a high school degree, their earnings, if it was 130 in 1981, it's only about 110 in 2017, implying that their real earnings have fallen by around 20%. So we haven't run out of work, but we have seen a lot of workers run out of good jobs. And that's very important. So that's the kind of economic context. And then I want to come back to that. But first, let me say a word about the technological context. So again, 2 points I want you to take away so far. Not running out of work, a lot of new things being created. However, the distribution of opportunities has become highly, highly skewed. And that's a real problem in my view. What about the technology? What actually is going on there? We in our task force, we spent a lot of time looking at robotics, at automated vehicles, at additive manufacturing, at the insurance industry, at medicine and medical technologies. And some of these examples, right? So, for example, autonomous vehicles will be one. I want to give you a single sentence that describes the kind of thrust of our findings here, which is that the momentous impacts of technological change are unfolding gradually. So, emphasis on 2 words: momentous. They really are huge, and gradual. They are not happening overnight. So we looked at autonomous vehicles, industrial robotics, intelligent supply chains. That's what, for example, Amazon uses, that sort of integrates everything from the point of production all the way to the point of distribution. Additive manufacturing, I'll say more about in a minute, and artificial intelligence. And all of these things have enormous potential to change what we do and how we do it, how we consume, how we work, how we communicate. They're quite important. But they are happening on a scale or a time scale that is understandable. So for example, we talk a lot about autonomous vehicles and how they may displace 1.3 to 2.3 million US workers eventually. And so it would be similar in size, for example, to the recent China trade shock in the beginning of the 2000s that had a very substantial impact on US manufacturing, very rather devastating, regionally concentrated impact on US manufacturing. That shock happened very quickly. It actually happened over the course of 7 years. Automated vehicles are going to happen much more slowly. So this figure shows you projected job losses from a very nice study by Susan Helper and colleagues. And you can see that we expect that maybe around 2040, there will be, we'll be losing more than 250,000 jobs in that time period. So that's important, but it's happening on a kind of a human timescale, and it matters because if you told me, look, come Labor Day of 2021, right, we're going to have no more truckers, that would be an enormous economic problem. That would be really devastating to a lot of individuals and to regional economies. If you told me we'd be by Labor Day of 2041, that would be the case, I'd say, well, we can work with that, right? That gives people time because they retire, they enter new fields. And so this is a manageable rate of change. Let me talk about another example, additive manufacturing. Additive manufacturing is such a cool idea. You've all heard of 3D printers. The kind of the deeper term that people use at MIT is additive manufacturing. And it's the opposite of most manufacturing is what you would call subtractive. You take a piece of material and you take stuff out of it, right? Or you might mold something. So in fact, you form material in the shape you want. Additive means Of course, you build it up by adding materials molecule by molecule, and you can mix materials. You can make shapes that would be impossible to make if you had to subtract material, because they would be hollow. You would have to put multiple things together. And these are just some examples of what's going on. So this is the MIT dome done with a kind of an early additive plastic printer, a 3D printer. This is a customized metal hip implant built for an individual. This is an aircraft fuel nozzle, right? So why would you additively manufacture something like that? One is, of course, it's a mixture of materials that are highly precise, so there's a lot to be gained. The other is you might only make a few. And if you're only making a few, setting up the mold is highly expensive relative to printing a few. So many of the major car manufacturers, for example, nowadays, they are no longer making old parts for their vehicles. They additively manufacture them in small lots as they are required. This is also great for prototyping. This is a faucet. You would see the water runs up these little channels on the exterior of the faucet, an orthodontic retainer, and so on. Additive manufacturing is another transformative technology. It has not had a large impact yet. It will. It will turn manufacturing into something that mostly right now is mostly physical to something that is largely digital, that manufacturing, the actual point of making something will be the very last point in an information supply chain, where things are not actually materialized until the final point of use or need, and yet they are the whole process of design and engineering happens, in a cognitive digital realm. It's a big deal, but it's happening slowly. At the moment, it's used very few places. It's primarily used for prototyping or for making very expensive exotic parts or for making old parts. In the long run, it will change the way we build, although it's not clear it will be used for mass production. It may not get that cheap. So what do we see looking at, across various cases, is that many of these applications take time, often the scale of decades, to develop and deploy, especially if we're talking about safety and production critical applications, things like driving or aircraft or health technologies. So the moment from, Eureka, we've made this work on a lab bench, to everybody's using it, is often a very long period of time. The one exception to that, of course, is software. Software disperses very, very quickly, but anything that is a big piece of infrastructure takes a long while. So the biggest obstacle to autonomous vehicles is that we really need to rebuild our roadways and signaling systems and energy supply systems to make them work properly. And we will. It just will take a couple of decades. Sorry, and this is just an example of the hype about auto driving. Let me just skip that. The second thing is many of the labor market consequences of technology that we're seeing today actually stem from technologies that are 20 to 40 years old that are having a big effect. So the internet, mobile computing, electronic health records, e-commerce, these are not actually new. They are all built on platforms that have been around for a while. It's now that they have diffused, that they are so widely used, that we begin to see their effects. So many of the important technologies, we've still, the present technologies like AI or like autonomous vehicles or like additive manufacturing, still have a ways to go. And is it really the case that I'm down to 8 minutes that I've been speaking for? I guess so. I'm going to speed up. I apologize. Okay. All right. So we can see glimpses of the future day, but it's going to take a long time to fully distribute. I apologize. I looked at my timer and I was alarmed by my time utilization. But I will not talk fast. I will instead cut out what is not relevant or doesn't need to be said. So I've given you two pictures here. One is of the labor market that's changing, and the greatest concern is inequality. I've given you another picture that says the technology is changing, but it's not changing that fast. So what are the actual challenges we face, and how do these two things interact? Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, actually, according to my clock, you've got 20 minutes left.
Okay,
if you wanted to shoot for 45 minutes.
Or maybe, I don't know what went wrong. Okay, great. I have 20 minutes left. Excellent. Okay, good. That's very helpful to know. Maybe I had my timer set on 1.5 speed, like my podcast. Okay, I'm gonna, so 20, okay, 20 minutes. Phew, I didn't think I had mistimed it that badly. Okay, so I said, look, there's jobs, and there will be very likely to be jobs. There's a lot of inequality. The technology is definitely changing, but it's revolutionary, but on a long time scale, not overnight revolutionary. So what are the actual challenges that we are facing? How do these two things interact? Well, I would say there are three things. One is that the technology is having a major effect on labor markets. It is important. And particularly the digitalization of work has made highly educated workers more productive and made less educated workers more easier to replace with machinery. So one way you can see this, if you look at the changes in the distribution of employment across occupations, so I initially put up those 12 occupations from 1940 to 2018. Here are those occupations again, minus farming because it's so small, over the 35-year period between 1980 and 2015. And I've broken them into three groups: low paying, medium paying, and high paying occupations. The low paying are personal services, cleaning and protective services, and laborer positions. The medium paying are production, administrative support, and sales, and the high paying are technical, professional, and managerial work. So the thing to notice about this figure is it's a bit of a barbell with a lot of poundage on either end of the bar. What's contracting here is a lot of this middle skill work, these production, administrative, office, and sales work. And these are what we call, many of us would call kind of, they're jobs that accomplish routine tasks, tasks that are well described by a series of steps and can increasingly be accomplished by software and hardware. And therefore, it's not that we don't need that work anymore, it's that it's done increasingly by machines. On the right-hand side, we see jobs that combine judgment and expertise, judgment, and creativity. So expertise is a body of knowledge. Judgment is how you apply that knowledge to a specific problem. And then creativity is how you apply to some new problem. And this is rapidly growing work. It's highly paid work. It's interesting work. It is work that requires high levels of education. And you can see, it's not a stretch to say, look, this work is made more productive by information technology. I gave many examples, not all my examples, of how our tools complement us. That's what we see most strongly in the right-hand side of the graph. On the left-hand side of the graph, we see a lot of these personal services and jobs that require physical labor, adaptability, dexterity, some spoken language, some common sense. And the irony is that work requires a lot of human capacities. It requires things that we can't do very well with machines. It's actually very hard to get a machine to clean a hotel room or to have a conversation with a person flexibly about some problem that they need to solve, or even to do home health assistance, which is an incredibly important low-paid job. The irony is, although that work is very difficult to automate, the supply of people who can do that work is highly abundant. Those use what you might call kind of built-in skills, many of those tasks, not all of them. And so as a consequence, that work has grown a lot numerically, but its pay levels have not grown very much at all. And that is a problem. So this medium pay work that is being eliminated is pretty specialized. Is relatively specialized, requires specific skills that are not, you have to learn to be a productive production worker or an administrative and office worker. That's less true to do personal services or cleaning. And so as work has shifted from the middle towards the bottom, it's created a lot of numerical employment at low levels of pay. Let me skip that. Oh, and let me show you how this has changed over time, given that I still have a few 16 minutes. If you look, for example, between 1940 and 1980, I had mentioned this growth of new work. If you look in these 4 decades, the blue bars show you existing work, and the red bars show you new work. That means new titles discovered by the Census Bureau that people wrote in. And you can see these things are very closely aligned. In other words, the flow of new work was a lot like the stock of existing work for non-college workers. It was concentrated in construction, transportation, production, clerical, administrative support work. If you look from 1980 to 2018, you can see that the stock of existing work, the blue lines, are still in construction, transportation, production, and clerical admin work. But the growth of new work is all in personal services and low-end health services, a little bit at the top. And so the type of new, although we are still creating new jobs for people without high levels of education, arguably the quality of those jobs is lower. That is, they require less expertise, less specialization, and therefore they will tend to be lower paid. I can show you those same figures for workers with some college or above. If we look between 1940 and 1980, you see again, let me just turn this on. Okay. you can see again that most not college educated workers or people with some college above were working on the right-hand side of this figure, and the new work was also on the right-hand side of this figure. If you go forward another 4 decades, what you see, whoops, sorry, that's not what I want. There we go. You can see that college work has moved even more strongly to the right, increasingly into technical and professional and managerial work. And interestingly, notice that clerical work, which was a big deal growing in the first 4 decades, is now shrinking, right? And that's that same decline of middle skill work, right? That's a technological change is having a big effect there. And if I can just riff a minute on this further, you say, well, why is the nature of work changing? Why is the new work appearing in different places from where it used to? Well, one reason is the nature of the technologies we're using is changing. So this figure shows you, this is kind of a stacked area plot of the distribution of patents between 1900 and 2020, or 2018. And so if you look in the first 3 decades, from around 1900 to 1930, most patenting is occurring either in transportation or in manufacturing processes or in engineering, construction, and mining. This is kind of the big machine age. Right? If you look from 1930 or 1940 to about 1980, the most rapidly growing category is chemical and metallurgy, right? So if those of you have seen the movie The Graduate, you'll think to yourselves, plastics, right? This is the era of better living through chemistry. If you look from 1980 to 2018, there are 2 categories that come to dominate all categories of all innovations that are registered by the US Patent Office. One is instruments and information, this orange group. The other is electricity and electronics, this purple group. So we have moved from an era of where innovation is mostly around physical objects, around manufacturing processes, transportation, chemistry, metallurgy, to where it's mostly around information products and ideas and the technologies that encode them. And that has implications for occupations because those use different groups of workers, right? When a lot of our innovation was in manufacturing and transportation and chemistry, metallurgy, we were creating a lot of middle skill jobs that were used in those activities. As we move into the information age, we are creating a lot of jobs that are complementary to those activities. Many of those are professional and technical jobs or jobs that involve communication, management, organization, and of course, formal reasoning. And we can see this in the data, actually, it's kind of interesting. Here we show you a set of occupations, and we plot on 2 axes. One is how much they're exposed to innovations that automate their tasks, that substitute for workers, and how much are they exposed to innovations that basically make them more valuable, that complement them. And you can see there's a kind of a range of things. So occupations like typesetters, programmers of numerically controlled machinery, or cabinet makers and bench carpenters, they're exposed to a lot of automation, but not a lot of complementary innovation. And so we expect those occupations to shrink over time. On the other hand, jobs like mechanical engineers or operation systems and research analysts, those jobs are exposed to not that much automation, but a lot of innovation. And so those occupations will tend to be growing. Then there are some that are exposed to both, right? There's a lot of new machinery that's replacing what people do, and then a lot of new technologies that are requiring more of those people. And then, of course, there are occupations that aren't subject to that much automation or that much innovation, and those tend to stick around, like childcare workers, college instructors. We know there's no innovation there, and clergy and religious workers. Now, you might say, well, what exactly are the innovations that affect clergy and innovation workers, religious workers anyway? Well, this actually refers to a specific new patent, which is a patent for collecting church donations at the end of services. That's one of our innovation occupations, activities that we measure in the data. Okay, so if I can just summarize, I've just said a lot of things about technology. The main thing I want to say is, in the first 4 decades after the Second World War, technology was sort of giving us a tailwind that was making it easy to grow the middle class, because it was growing producing a lot of highly productive middle skill production and office jobs that didn't require 4-year college degrees, and helped a lot of people with moderate levels of education to be highly productive. Over the last 4 decades, technology is much more a headwind for good jobs, because it has been eroding exactly that set of jobs that were created during the first 4 decades after the World War, and much more creating a lot of work that is professional and technical and highly educated. Those are also good jobs, but they're not middle-class jobs. And so technology, it has gone from sort of creating a healthy middle class to, in some sense, eroding it by reducing the number of jobs that are accessible to people without high levels of education. A second force is globalization. Trade, in particular, I mentioned this earlier, has been a huge positive for world welfare. Let me be very clear about that. China's rise has been the best thing that's happened to human welfare in essentially forever. But it has placed a lot of pressure on manufacturing jobs and manufacturing-intensive communities in countries that compete with China, and the United States being one of those. Especially during the early 2000s, when China became a member of the World Trade Organization, U.S. manufacturing employment really plummeted, and U.S. Imports of Chinese goods expanded really rapidly. And although this isn't an enormous number of jobs relative to a labor market of 150 million workers, it was highly regionally concentrated, right? It took out, all the furniture manufacturing in one place, all the textile manufacturing in another, all of the assembly and toy making in another, and those things are very regionally concentrated. So that is a big deal. The U.S. handled it quite badly, did not prepare, did not insure people, and it had traumatic economic and political and social consequences as well. That's a second factor. The third, however, and I think this really deserves some emphasis, is that not all of these things are due to either of these impersonal forces, either technology, which is, we tend to think of as happening on its own, although we shape it to a great deal, not globalization, but also institutions that we choose to build or neglect that affect the quality of jobs available to rank and file workers. So, for example, this compares the pay of low educated workers in leading industrial economies. You could think of these people working at McDonald's, for example. In the US, that worker would make about $10.33 an hour in adjusted purchasing power adjusted earnings. Let's say in Germany, they might make $18 an hour. In Norway, $21 an hour. Now you might say, oh, come on, don't compare us to Scandinavia. Everybody does that. We know Scandinavia is another planet. Okay, fine. But just compare us to Canada, right? Our neighbor to the north. McDonald's workers are making about 33% more per hour in Canada. We do not think they're 33% more productive per hour in Canada. That just can't be true. That's a choice that Canadians have made about what level of inequality or low pay to tolerate in jobs. You can see this also in the real value of our federal minimum wage, which has fallen to near irrelevance in recent years. So the real federal minimum wage in 2019 dollars is about equivalent to the real federal minimum wage in 1950 dollars. If you take current prices and took the federal minimum wage back to 1950, you would see that people were making $7.50 an hour in current dollars if they were earning the minimum wage. And let me point out, simply maintaining the real minimum wage at a fixed level is not a very great accomplishment when productivity is rising at a couple percentage points per year. I told you that we are, 250% more productive per hour in 2018 than we were in 1930s, in 1940, effectively. We were probably 150% more productive per hour in 2018 than we were in 1950, and yet the real federal minimum wage hasn't moved at all. You would expect it to rise with societal productivity. That's a policy choice. That's not an economic necessity. Collective bargaining, the role of labor unions. The US has never been very high, but labor unions have fallen from about 25% or 28% of workers in 1948 to about 12% in 2018. If you were to take out people working in the public sector, that would be about 7%. You can have mixed feelings about labor unions. They have some positives and some negatives, but they did a lot for the quality of jobs done by rank and file workers, and they aren't able to do much of that anymore. So the point I want to make is, technology has been important, globalization has been important, but these institutional forces reflect societal choices. They reflect the decision of how we want to structure economic activity. It's not purely a market phenomenon. So then you might say, well, okay, that's fine. We're making all these choices, and the US is obviously highly laissez-faire relative to other countries, but aren't we getting a positive return on that inequality? Doesn't that give us greater dynamism, greater opportunity, faster growth, right? Isn't that the trade-off that we're making here? Well, let's consider that. The US has quite low rates of labor force participation. So here's the employment rate of US adult men compared to Sweden or Germany, for example, and we're pretty low. You would think with low wages, you'd think, oh, well, everybody can work. Nobody's priced out of the labor market. Turns out when wages are sufficiently low, a lot of people just choose not to work. This is the same figure for women, right? Again, US women's labor force participation, employment rates are not impressive by world standards. So one thing we're not getting out of our high levels of inequality is high rates of labor force participation. What about economic mobility? The likelihood that people go from rags to riches. This figure by Miles Korak shows a very well-known negative relationship. So on the x-axis is the level of inequality at a point in time. So if we go to one person has all the money. If we go to 0, everyone has the same amount of income. On the y-axis is intergenerational mobility, the probability that you go from a low-income household to a high-income household effectively. And you can see that countries that tend to have high inequality at a point in time tend to have low intergenerational mobility. In other words, countries that are very unequal, the likelihood of going from rags to riches is not very high. The US does not stand out. We have high levels of inequality and low levels of mobility. Compare us again to our neighbor at the north, Canada, or here's Scandinavia, if you don't mind. If you want to find a country that has more inequality and less mobility than the US, well, you better start looking to Peru, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, right? Which is many great things about those countries, but this is not the dimension on which I would want to emulate them. So we often tell ourselves we're a country of great opportunity, and in some ways we are, but on average, the US has, people tend to get rather stuck in place. My Harvard colleague, Raj Chetty, says, if you want to realize the American dream of going from being born in the bottom quartile and rising to top quartile, you should go to Canada. It's much more likely to achieve the American dream in Canada than it is in the United States. Finally, you might say, well, what about growth? Doesn't the US grow much faster than other countries? And the answer there is, again, no. This shows you the levels of real GDP, that's output per person in 1960. Here's output per person in 2017. And you see this downward sloping relationship. This reflects catch-up growth. Poorer countries tend to grow faster because they get to use all the frontier technologies that they get from other countries. Rich countries tend to grow slower because the only way for them to grow faster is they have to do more innovation. The US was a rich country in 1960. It's a rich country still. It has not grown faster than other countries. In fact, it's exactly where you would expect it to be. It's actually grown slower than many of the other countries that we compare ourselves to. That is not a failure of performance. It's actually a statistical regularity, but it does tell you there's nothing spectacular. The US is not getting some amazing growth benefit out of all of its inequality and all of its flexibility. Doesn't seem to be happening. Okay, so I want to wrap up because I don't want to go over time. I'll leave time for questions. So let me talk about the work of the future just a little bit. In our report, we look at these technological forces, we look at these institutional forces, and we say, well, how can we do better, right? The problem isn't a lack of jobs. The problem isn't a lack of economic growth or rising productivity. It's primarily one of a poor distribution of outcomes given those good ingredients, right? We have work, we have rising average incomes, and yet we have poor opportunities, poor outcomes for the median citizen, the median worker. So one, of course, and you knew I would say this, is we need to invest and innovate in skills and training. That's not sufficient, but it is necessary. So for example, if you compare the US to other OECD countries and what we spend on what are called active labor market programs that help people who are unemployed build new skills and enter the labor force, right? If you were to look at, for example, Denmark spends almost 3% of GDP on this. Germany spends about 1.5%. Lithuania spends 0.7%. The US spends 0.3%, right? So, so 10% of what Denmark does. We are pretty stingy on this. We invest in people. We invest a lot in higher education. We invest a fair amount in K-12 education. We invest very little in adults. That's one thing we could do better. It's not sufficient, but it is necessary. The second is to ensure that productivity gains translate into better quality jobs. How can we do that? Well, one thing we could do is raise the federal minimum wage. That is not, by no means a sufficient thing to do, but it's a starting point. The evidence suggests that there's room to do that. But there are many ways that we need to do this. And the failure to do that, I think, is quite costly. And again, I compared us to these other countries for a reason. Canada, Denmark, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, France, all these countries are subject to the same set of technological forces and globalization forces of the United States. And yet they've produced a different set of outcomes. And that's because of these institutional choices. There is room to change the set of within certain constraints. There's room to produce different outcomes with the same ingredients. I was struck by a letter written to the New York Times by a gentleman named Daniel Wasik from Fanwood, New Jersey, who is a precision machinist. And he wrote a long letter to the Times, and he blogs on this topic, simply to say, look, we're not treating working class people like me well. We must find a more equitable balance between wages, productivity, and profits. A rise in productivity should trigger a rise in salary. And when profits soar, the working people instrumental in that success should share in its bounty. And there's a lot to be said for that. I'm have a lot of kind of traditional economic sympathies, but ultimately it's not healthy for a society when there is such a disconnect between productivity and the experience of the typical worker. I think that's actually highly costly. So we have control to some degree about translating rising productivity into rising opportunity. Finally, and this is very important, is I've talked a lot about technology. Innovation is ultimately an ally, or should be an ally, in this process. A lot of producing better outcomes depends on having rising incomes, which people are willing to share. Increasing productivity, increasing innovation is ultimately what gives rise to improving living standards over time. And this is an area where the US has really slacked. So if you compare public investment into R&D as a share of GDP, US public investment has actually fallen about 40% since 1985. That's not correct. It's fallen from 40% of R&D to about 25% between 1985 and 2015. Private sector R&D has risen such that the total level has stayed about the same, but public and private sector R&D are complements, not substitutes. In general, public sector R&D pays for primary fundamental innovations in physics, in energy generation, in fundamental understanding of the world, and those things get commercialized. And when the federal government slacks off, ultimately in the long run, we're poorer. And and if you don't find that hard, if that doesn't seem plausible, think about technologies like the internet, like self-driving cars, like a lot of the health technology we use. They were first paid for either by the military, by the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, or by the National Institutes of Health. We benefit a lot from those innovations. So let me just conclude. The message I most want to leave you with is that the work of the future is ours to invent. It is not predetermined. We have a lot of degrees of freedom in how we shape innovation and how we use productivity to affect collective outcomes. Right now, I think there's a palpable fear of the future, of what technology is going to bring. And I think of that as a consequence of the divergence between innovation and labor market opportunity. That someone once said very recently, all of our fears of technology are really about our fears of capitalism. No one's afraid that the technology is going to, itself, directly harm us. It's that that in our market system, the technology will mean the end of their job. And we should be thinking about whether we can do better on that. If we deploy the new technologies that are coming into existing labor market systems, we will get the same problematic results. But we can do better. We can, I believe it's justifiable to reject the sort of false trade-off between economic growth and strong labor markets. If we look across the experience of many countries, they have a lot of economic growth with a fair amount of shared prosperity. We do not have to be in the corner in which we are in. And so the final thought I'd leave you with is the majority of today's jobs had not been invented a century ago, as I pointed out earlier. And the job of the present is to build the work of the future in a form that we view as desirable and sustainable and commensurate with the opportunities that are available to us, given the technologies and the productivity gains that we are and will experience. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for that very interesting presentation, David. I'm going to take the prerogative of the host to ask the first question. It's a political economy question, and you've dabbled in political economy some yourself.
Yeah.
Shouldn't say dabbled, you've done some really interesting work in the area. And so it's the what about, or what's the matter with Kansas question. It seems like politically, some of the folks who should be most on board with the sorts of changes you'd like to see have been voting for the people who are the primary block that prevents us from adopting policies like increasing the minimum wage or making it easier for workers to unionize, in addition to taking more interest in active labor market policies and doing other things to promote the good functioning of the labor market. What do you see as a path to getting to that point where we could institute the sorts of changes that you're advocating?
Yeah, okay, so really, thank you. So there are a number of questions built into that, right? One is, if this is desirable, why aren't we doing it? Why aren't the people who would seemingly benefit the most are the ones, why aren't they supporting it more strongly? And two is, how do we change that? So let me answer the first question about why aren't people supporting it more strongly. I would say there are a couple of reasons. One, in fact, many of the things I talked about are popular and yet are not supported politically, right? So raising the minimum wage actually is, supported by majorities of citizens, as is gun control, for example, as is some degree of collective bargaining and so on. So our government doesn't represent us well, at least one of our parties doesn't represent us well in giving voice to even things that are popular. The second, of course, is that politics is much more complicated than kind of economic interest, and there's a lot of work in political science and in economics about the way that economic fissures can be channeled into different forms of interpretation or identity, whether they are used, and a lot of the tension, in fact, in politics is, do you get people to align along economic interests, or do you get them to align along identity and race and ethnic interests? And when there's societal pressures, as we experience now, some politicians try to channel into one and some try to channel into another. And they have very different consequences, and they do different things for that. And so we are in the US and in many countries, a war between how we define our conflicts. Do we think of them as divergent economic interests, or do we think of them as divergent racial and ethnic interests? And those lead to very different policies. So how do we get to a different place? I don't know. I will say that, we have done actually fairly revolutionary things during the pandemic. The CARES Act, for example, which took 10% of US GDP and gave it to people, gave it to households, gave it to businesses, and gave it to people through the unemployment insurance system who were never employed in the normal sense of the unemployment insurance system. That was fairly radical. And we'll have to see, and it was fairly successful. It was actually quite successful. I mean, the law was far from perfect, but the cost of not passing the law was much higher than the cost of passing the law in the long run in terms of our economic recovery and the insurance of a lot of the citizens. I would say in many ways it's given us an appetite for more big action. And I think if the government does more big action, then much of it will be well received. If we rebuild infrastructure, if we invest in children, if we set up a nationwide broadband system that's accessible to everyone and affordable, if we electrify the vehicle fleet and rebuild our energy generation stock, many good things will happen from that. We are right now in a moment where people believe the government can't do things, and therefore it doesn't do things, and then their beliefs are confirmed. So it's going to take a big push. Whether we get one now, we will see, but I'm optimistic that if we actually go big, people will come out feeling more invest in the idea that the government can be successful in these domains. That's sort of a long answer to a very hard question.
Okay, thank you. First question that we have from the audience is from Ken Kerber, and he wants to know, what is the relative value of technological expertise versus interpersonal relationship building expertise with respect to doing the work of the future?
That's a great question. And I think they're both important and they're better together. So, it is the case that if you're doing something that's just purely kind of, calculating or, following procedure, that it's very likely that that can also be mechanized. If you're doing a activity that's just purely interpersonal, that's just, being empathetic and listening and so on, that's great too, but there are many people who may be able to do that work. The most valuable jobs in the economy, usually, or many of them, are ones that basically combine a body of technical expertise with a set of interpersonal skills for communicating, right? Whether that's being, being a medical doctor would be a very good example of that. Many management jobs are that. I think the thrust of the question, and a very important one that is underscored by it, is it's a mistake to think that all of the great work of the future, all the great jobs, are just people who are, botnet herders and AI specialists and Bitcoin miners and so on. That's definitely not right. In general, the skills that have become more valuable in the last couple of decades are some analytical skills, but just as much they are communicating, leading, organizing, working in teams. So I would say the best thing is work that combines those two things virtuously, that allows you to take those interpersonal and management and leadership skills and leverage them with technology to deliver some high value service.
Okay, thank you. Next, let me ask you a question from an anonymous attendee. How do you think about President Biden's plan to raise federal minimum wage to $15? Is it a good time for this change, and is the plan feasible?
I think raising the federal minimum wage is a good idea. It's at a very low level, and I think it serves a useful function, which is it sets a floor. And 21 US states have no minimum wage other than the federal minimum wage. And even if their citizens support it, it's very hard to get them through, except like when Florida did it by referendum very recently. And so I think if the federal government doesn't play that role, many states, even against the interests and desires of their citizens, will not raise the federal minimum wage. $15 is a high number. I would be worried about doing that so quickly. There are some states where, that's equal to the median wage. So you're now saying everybody needs to earn at least what the 50th percentile worker earns. That's a little bit risky. I would much rather see the most important thing is it needs to be raised, and it should be indexed to median earnings in the US economy, so it rises over time. The way the minimum wage looks in the United States is like a set of stairs that goes up and then down, 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 and then up, down, 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 right? And that's not healthy for anybody in particular. That's a system that is a function of political misfunction rather than a good economic policy. Does it need to be 15? I think that may be a step too far. If we do go there, I hope we do it slowly over the course of some years. I feel much more strongly. I would be very comfortable raising it to 11 or 12 over the course of a few years, and the most importantly, then indexing it thereafter, so it doesn't go through this crazy period of neglect and then sudden jumps.
Okay, thank you. So as not to overly abuse you, but if it's okay with you, can you field one more question for us?
I'm happy to take a few more questions.
Okay. Chris Flynn asks, your lecture clearly emphasizes the importance of training, improving job skills, and the lecture implied unionization can improve labor market. Do you feel unionization will improve the education of our labor force?
So unions have historically played a role in apprenticeships and entry into skilled trades, and they can still play that role. I want to be clear, maybe I probably wasn't very clear. I think worker voice is essential. I think the labor systems of labor collective bargaining we have in the United States are highly problematic. And they go back to the 1935 to the Wagner Act, which envisioned a form of collective bargaining that's highly adversarial. And collective bargaining in the United States is highly adversarial. Imagine if I told you I'm going to pass a minimum wage by legislating one McDonald's at a time, to raise its wages. You would say that's a crazy idea. Like even if the fast food sector can bear higher wages, you certainly wouldn't want to do that one restaurant at a time because it's going to put those guys out of business. Well, that's a bit how unionization works in the United States. They fight one workplace at a time to change business practices, and that is, not competitively desirable from the point of view of firms in that sector. So although I strongly favor increased worker collective voice, I do think the institutions we have are maximally conflictual and not a very good way to get everybody represented or to come to broad societal bargains. So you might say, well, what are the alternatives? In most other advanced economies, you have what's called sectoral bargaining, which means bargains are done at the level of the steel sector or the auto sector or the garment sector. It's not one firm at a time. And so there's a much more, why is it more feasible? One, you can integrate a lot more views, but also firms recognize that their competitors are subject to the same labor rules that they are. So it doesn't feel particularly costly to say, oh my God, here I am, Amazon, my warehouses are about to be unionized, but Walmart doesn't have that problem. Like, isn't that bad for me? Wouldn't it be better if we did this collectively? So I think unions have an important role to play. I am a supporter of collective bargaining, but I do think we need to update that dramatically. The Wagner Act actually hasn't changed at all in the 85 years since it was implemented, except the Taft-Hartley Act that slightly weakened it in 1947.
And if I might add, there are things like work consoles, worker membership on boards of directors and things like that that are common in other countries that make for a more integrative environment between labor
and are illegal in the United States. Under the Wagner Act, you actually cannot have those.
Right. Okay, well, David, I want to thank you so much for coming today. It's been great to see you, and I hope that we can have you back at some point in the future for another one of these forums.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you for the folks who came. Thank you for those who asked questions, and I apologize if I cut too much into question time. I just reflection of my enthusiasm for the topic, but I really appreciate the opportunity to speak. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, David. And everyone, thanks for coming, and look forward to seeing you all next year when we'll have another round of economic policy forums.
Excellent. Okay, I guess we say goodbye.
I think so.
All right, bye. Great to see you, Bill.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.